Hey guys, how are you doing today?
Yeah, good, 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 good. How are you all?
Yeah, feeling good.
Good.
So today I wanted to see if you guys want to take a break from all the latest and greatest AI news. And I realized there's a story we haven't told. And that's our story. The story of Spiral and the story of what we've been doing for the last year. It's actually a really cool story, and not just to tell our story, but I think that what we've been doing the last year, it has a lot of valuable insights for anyone who just wants to start building agents or they want to hire someone to do it for them. We've certainly learned so much about this process. And we are continuing to develop and improve our agent that we've built for creating email newsletters. And we can go into the functionality of our agent a little bit later. But I realized that I was looking at my calendar today, and I know that Xavier and I think, met either late April or early May last year at a co-working space in Playa del Carmen. And we met because I had gotten hired to do some AI consulting for a client who wanted to build an email newsletter, but didn't really have the staff to produce it every week. And I had gotten as far as I could in my own research and like the tools and the ways that we could train an LLM to write like the client, but I needed to put it all together and streamline all the information that I was pulling for the client. I needed to automate that process. And it really was clear that I needed something much like more. And I thought at first that I needed like a systems person, like someone who knew like Zapier and connect things. And the more I understood and researched for my client, I realized what I needed was like a systems architect, a AI technology architect to put a lot of things together and connect them in ways that I didn't know how. So in our co-working space WhatsApp chat, I just threw out my problem and to see if anyone could help me. And Xavier and another guy from our co-working space were willing to meet. And I explained the problem that I had. And we had like a whiteboard and we were writing down all the different data inputs. And then the next, like 2 days later, we met on the weekend at the co-working space. We made a whole day thing out of it, experimenting with this new tool we had just heard of called N8N. And I remember leaving that day and we had basically created an MVP that pulled from different data sources and wrote an email newsletter. It wasn't a great one, but it did the bare minimum. And I remember feeling like I had just like made a scientific discovery. Like I was just like, this is so amazing. And that kind of kicked off this like, wow, look at all these opportunities, like what AI can do for us and help get ideas out into the world. And when we presented this MVP, this idea, hey, this is what we think we can do for you to the client, they were like, yes, they were like blown away. And now, because AI time goes so fast, looking back like a year ago, that seems like so like basic now. But our minds were blown. And do you remember that? Like what can you kind of explain going back in time where you were at in your AI journey at that point and as a software developer, and what intrigued you about the project that I was needing help with?
Yeah, for sure. So I got into AI around the time GPT-2 had dropped. And at that time, they didn't have like an interface like ChatGPT. That didn't exist, right? Long story short, I was in another co-working space in Atlanta. And there were a few friends of mine that had co-founded AI companies, right? Just doing different things. And they were showing me kind of like what they were prototyping with GPT-2. And I thought it was super cool, right? So kind of fast forward to where we're at when you and I met. I've been working full time in AI for about 6 or 7 months at that time. And basically was making a transition from being like a software engineer to being more like an AI engineer, right?
Mhm.
Building like automations, chatbots, playing around with all that kind of stuff. And yeah, just like AI like really fascinated me. At that time, I was building some of my first projects using AI, using tools like Cursor and some other ones that I kind of forget now. And yeah, so when you and I met, I was not even aware of N8N at that time. Like I had heard of it, but I didn't know what it was. But I had heard of Zapier and also Make.com. So when you first came to me and the other guy, and we started working on this, that was kind of one of the decisions that we had to make, whether we were going to go with N8N, Make, or Zapier. N8N just fit our needs way more. It was the most complicated platform of the three. Make was kind of in the middle, and Zapier was the easiest. But for our use case, it was actually easier to build what we built using N8N. And the same thing, the first time we actually got it to generate an output, and not only that, it created a draft in the guy's email, in the client's email. He saw it. He was like, dude, this is like the coolest thing ever, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah. And I remember like I was like, what is this N8N thing? Like I logged in, I did the trial. I was like, I do not understand. Like it was and so there was kind of this discussion for like normal average people. Make seemed like the user friendly version, even though it had limitations. In your eye, like do you think N8N was more for developers, people with higher level tech skills?
Yeah. So N8N is definitely more so for developers, even when you're building these automations. So N8N, Make, Zapier, I like to call them Legos for automation. So you get these little Lego blocks out of the box with Zapier, Make, and N8N, and then you get to put them together to create whatever you're trying to create. N8N was the most difficult because even though you're doing this drag and drop kind of Lego building, there is still a bit of coding that you have to do.
Okay.
Us, because we needed our client data to stay private, and we couldn't use like their cloud service. So N8N has a cloud service you can pay for. So we actually had to create our own little cloud server and host our own instance of N8N, which actually made it also the cheapest option. So it's also like a lot cheaper than using Make and Zapier, which was also good for us as well.
Okay. And so what would you say, like for someone who's trying to decide between like Make or N8N, what would you recommend that someone use if they want to build an agent?
So my general recommendation, and this is like with anything in life, but specifically when you're building a product or a service, start with the thing that can get you up the quickest. So initially we thought that might have been Zapier. We figured out pretty fast that that wasn't going to suit our needs. And then we played around with Make.com, just seeing if we can put some basic things together. That didn't fit our needs. And then we went to N8N. So that's kind of what I would suggest to people. Take the thing that could get your product or service out the fastest and the easiest for you, and start with that. And don't try to build the whole thing. Just build enough to see if it can do what you want. And if that doesn't give you what you need, scale up to the next option.
Yeah.
Yes, with Make, that was okay. So just to walk people backwards, the client also needed to they didn't know what their newsletter was going to be about. They didn't know what it was going to be called. They didn't know how to really write what their audience wanted to hear. And so I did all the brand messaging and the research on the front end, and I helped discover what pieces of information they wanted to include. And then I manually, just like I would as a copywriter or a journalist, I put together the first one based on the research I conducted, based on client interviews, based on some of the sources they had shared in their space, based on um, based on some news and events that were happening in their organization. Some had been publicly shared, some were from the client's LinkedIn post. So I had figured out at that point, we need to automatically connect LinkedIn, Google Calendar with events that the organization's having, the sources they use to stay informed and they want to share with their readers, their marketing partners. I kind of knew all the parts and pieces. So that's, I think important to preface what we were coming in with, because that discovery for me took a couple months. That was the bulk of the initial project. I'm curious, what case do you think something like Make would be fine? Or even now, I mean, this was before Claude Cowork. This is before Claude Code. And I know people are using Claude to build agents. If somebody's wanting to connect different data inputs or even just their social media feed. So I know Make is really good for social media, take these posts and repurpose them for LinkedIn, I don't know. You can even take emails. You could take something. But
Yeah.
I'd love to hear now what are the capabilities? What are the options too, compared to a year ago when we first started and we were looking at doing this?
To be honest, Lucy, it's really the same things. So much hasn't changed there as far as the options. You do have some newer options. I'm going to mispronounce the name of the company, but I think it's called Lindy. And Lindy is like, imagine if N8N and something like Lovable had a baby, where you can build these workflows the same way you can build them in N8N or even something like Make or Zapier. But instead of you putting the pieces together yourself, you can prompt an AI to like build it for you. And then you can go in and manually kind of fine tune it if you want to. So you have options like that. But even back then, the other option you brought up was like actually connecting directly with like an AI API and kind of rolling your own agent yourself instead of depending on a platform like N8N or Zapier. That option existed then too. But at that time, it was overkill for what we were trying to do. So this kind of goes into what we were talking about earlier that we'll talk about kind of what we're doing now. But what we're doing now wouldn't have made sense for us to do a year ago. It would have took us too much time, it would have cost too much money to do it. And at that point, we just needed to validate that it was possible to do what we wanted. And that was good enough for us at that time. But now we're transitioning to a point where we want to scale this out and move past just an MVP and give users a real product that they can just plug and play and use without us having to build that custom infrastructure for them each time.
And one of the things I know that N8N, when it started asking for API keys, that felt like a whole different level to me.
Yeah.
Um, so, I know we already did an episode covering kind of what API keys are, why you need them to build agents, but in terms of, that level, like, do you feel like it's a fairly complex thing, like, to start bringing maybe experts in on once you're trying to connect API keys, not only to establish them in the agent, but also to protect your data?
Yeah, for sure. I think that API keys are a lot simpler than most people think. So basically all you're doing, I know, and when you first find out about them, it's like, yo, what is this,
Well,
right?
the first we connected,
Yeah,
remember, it was like a lot, like we have like a SO, there's a many, many steps. Like, I don't know if that's
yeah.
gotten me now.
Yeah, so it depends on the API. So for those who don't know who are watching this, an API is just basically a way for you to connect your app into someone else's app and like send data back and forth between them. For instance, you might want to pull in some stock data from Bloomberg or something like that. And it's like a lot of work for you to go out and try to get that data yourself. It's better for you to go to an existing data provider. It might be weather data. It might be stock data. It might be data from Facebook or LinkedIn, et cetera. And basically all an API does is like a connector, like a tunnel between your app and their app, right? More so your app and their data, or it can go the other way, your data and their app. So that's all an API really is. And then the API keys is basically the signature that identifies you and your app as the one that's requesting or sending the data to their platform. We went over that in a previous episode, so I won't go deep on that. But that's all that is. As far as like the complexity of getting the API key, it depends on who you're pulling the source from. So we had a complex time with ours because we were trying to pull like his Gmail data and his document data, his calendar data from Google. So the steps are a little more intense for that. But something like Twitter or Reddit, plugging into their API, they won't make you jump through those many hoops because it's just like social data that's already available on the internet. They're just giving you access to it. Another example of something that we've had a hard time or that was difficult getting plugged into was LinkedIn. So I don't know if you remember, Lucy, but we both applied to get a LinkedIn API key. You got denied and I got stalled out. I'm still like waiting to hear back from them. And that's
There's so
yeah,
much like business information too, like your
yes.
website, like business incorporation paper.
Yeah, we had to make sure we had a privacy policy on a website that at the time we didn't even have. So we had to spin up a website, right? And we had to create a privacy policy. And the privacy policy had to directly address how we were going to use their data and tell the users how the app was handling that. That's a whole story. But LinkedIn is an example of one that's notoriously hard to get an API key for. So that's another thing. Just because you want to get access to data doesn't mean they're going to make it easy. There's also a lot of companies that charge for access to that data. So for example, like Bloomberg or like very difficult financial information, or like you said, like LinkedIn, like your personal data, companies might charge you for that. And it might be a flat fee, but it usually is for every time you access it. So every time you hit their API, they'll charge you. It might be 3 cents or 5 cents, something like that. It just depends on the API.
So that's where like the complexity. That's where I would want someone who's with,
And that's why things like
and the
make
other thing,
help. Because you're not, make, like I think that's also, going back to what Xavier said about starting at the bottom and working, and then working your way to the top to start with what's ever easier because something like make, all those integrations are already there, they already exist. And you don't
Yep.
have to go and reinvent the wheel until you really need to. And that's what we found, as, things worked until they didn't. And then when they didn't work, we moved past that and are now doing our own thing.
Yeah. I haven't looked at Zapier or Make in a while, but you're right, Kelly. A lot of those connections come out of the box, and you don't necessarily have to go and get an API key. So, for instance, you may want to create an automation where every time you tweet something, I don't know, it might email like your news list or something, right? Something small like that. With Zapier, you would just have to connect, like log into Twitter and then log into Gmail or whatever your email provider is. And then they handle that API connection for you on the back end.
Yeah,
So that's an
exactly.
example of where something like Zapier would be way easier. But just because it's easier doesn't mean that it fits your needs. So sometimes you may have to make a trade off.
Exactly. Yeah. And then when you get to that point where you're making too many trade-offs, that's when you decide to go to the next best thing. Or like we're doing is, okay, we've got to do our own thing now.
Yep, exactly.
yeah, and I wanted, we'll get into like what changed for us within Aiden, but like first off, I just, I want to reiterate like we built the agent, but we've been improving it, making it better and better, making
Yeah.
it faster, making it integrate with email service providers, like looking at new functionality and new features and new inputs for data sources and improving the writing, improving the tone, just making it function easier, actually capturing ideas. And we wanted to solve the problem of how for busy people, busy CEOs and founders capturing their ideas and then getting them out into the world, there's a lot of bottlenecks there. And so we wanted to create a tool, really, number one, that makes it easier to capture. So when you get a good idea, you can record it, you can write it down, you can fold it into the newsletter, and it comes and does like some other work for you in terms of research or formulating the idea. I know that's something I've personally always struggled with. I have a lot of great ideas, but I have a hard time keeping up with them. And then those aha moments and moments that make great thought leadership are happening throughout the day, through every meeting, through every interaction. But then they're lost a lot of times if someone doesn't have a practice of really sitting down and capturing them, what I want to say. So that was number one we wanted to solve. And it was less about creating something that just generated content or just pushed the easy button. It was more like we wanted to take a really thoughtful approach. How can we just make ideas easier? I just saw a lot of opportunity in newsletters because they are growing. They're becoming digital media assets. They are great for creating new information that people really need based on trends or industries or what's going on. Not so we're not talking about sales funnels or sales emails necessarily. We're talking about email newsletters that are a little bit different. So within that, you know, especially now, it's like people are like, I vibe coded this app in like a day. Okay. To me, when I hear that, I'm like, great, that's their starting point. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about kind of, I think there's a perception that you can just build an agent like that. And yes, for some things, you can automate something that's a tedious task very easily. But what we were doing and we are doing, like, it's a bit nuanced and creative and um, looking at a way to extract and capture the best ideas to create really relevant content. So within that, when you hear people are like, hey, I can build this agent in a day or two, like, what is your response usually?
Yeah. I mean, you can. So let's not take away from that. You can do
Right.
that. You can build a whole app, you can create a company in 24 hours now using AI. And you could have done that in the past without AI, but now you can create something that's relatively compelling, like out of the gate. So The way I see AI is that, before you would start at like maybe one, whereas with AI, you're starting on like the fifth or the 10th floor. So your floor is higher. So I give people that. The thing about it though is that there's a lot of things that you can't do just in like one day. The best software, the best agents, the best anything in the world are things that are built upon. So yes, you can build something in a day, but that shouldn't be like your final product. Like you said, Lucy, that's your starting point, and you should iterate on that, improve upon it as you learn new things, or as like just the nature of the technology or the industry changes, you should be moving along with that.
And then there's so many more considerations. There's UX, there's the user experience, testing that, testing the actual tech, finding what like trying to break your own technology, right? How is the actual functionality? How does it work? And then data protection, making sure that our clients' information is protected. It's not easy to hack. Those mechanisms in place and figuring out how to do that
Yeah.
was like took some time.
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, there's a lot of moving parts. So you have UX, which is like the user experience, which is very hard to nail. You also have UI, which is different. It's like how the app actually looks. So think of like your layout, your fonts, your colors, etc. Another part of UX and UI that a lot of people don't consider is copy. Copy really, really matters on your website and even in your app, because if you have bad copy in your application, you can confuse your users and they don't know how to like navigate through the app just because you decide to like, I don't know, name the home tab something like weird or esoteric. So that's important. Like you said, your data. So you have to have a place to store data. So you have to set up a database, but you also have to secure that data. So authentication and RLS policies and a bunch of other things I won't get into, all that stuff matters as well. I mean, you have marketing, there's a bunch to just building something. So yes, you can like vibe code something really quick, but there's so many other pieces that you need to kind of nail to actually launch a successful product or website, etc.
Mm.
Yeah, and that intersection of human, AI can't tell, how the human brain works. And so that's where the UX and the UI come in and are so important, because you could build something really great, but if your user doesn't know how to use it, or it's difficult to use or frustrating to use, you may as well not have. And so that's where all that iteration and the human side of the coding then comes in to like fix that and make it this really beautiful thing that people want to interact with.
Yeah, for sure. Just for us alone, we've gone
Correct.
through maybe 4 or 5 different iterations
Exactly.
of the user experience. So we started off with a Telegram kind of chat bot for you to build your newsletter that way. And then we moved on to building like our own kind of chatbot interface using Gemini Open API keys to kind of generate it. Then we moved over to kind of like what we call our V1,
Right.
where we had an actual interface where you can like add notes and do things like that. And now we're moving on to what we call our V2,
Mm.
where it's just a lot more robust, kind of like notebook kind of style thing
Yeah.
that also has an additional tool for capturing ideas like throughout your day. So just for us in the last year, we've built 4 different products,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah, and it just gets better every time. And the experience of using it, even for ourselves who know how to use it, with focusing more on the UX and the UI, it just gets easier and easier. And just every iteration just makes it better. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm not, I was wondering too, okay, so let's get to the point where we realize an 8M just wasn't going to work.
Yeah. So like I said, for us to do this initial MVP, and even use it in production for the client for several months, actually, it was fine. But then we hit a point where, because we didn't control the platform we were building on, every time they upgrade or change something, it affected us. Also, we had a issue. One of the big issues was actually the API connections. It was very hard with N8N to connect to something, have that connection like stay there without you having to go into the actual N8N server and like re-authenticate. And I found some workarounds for that for some integrations, but for others, I wasn't able to find a workaround for that. So that was one thing. The big thing for us is that we just reached a point where we had figured out what the product ideally should be. And we figured out that it was better for us to build the back end, the actual bones that the product sat on. It was better for us to build and control that ourselves.
Mm.
Took us a while to get there, but it just allows us a lot more optionality and a lot more control, not just with how the product is built or the back end of it, but also with the user data. Even though we're hosting it ourselves on our own end-to-end server, it's just better to have it go through your own platform than you being a third party to your own data, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I remember you saying that one of the frustrations with the earlier versions, the API key, things would just break and you have to constantly go in to replace things. Whereas with our version now, that works, just there's less of that sort of breakage because you've programmed it in yourself and you know that it just
Yes.
always will work and it will always pull the data. Whereas some of those integrations with NNN, something would update and then boom, it wouldn't work anymore. And that's
Yep.
where, yeah.
The other part about this is that if there's a data connection that is dropped in our V2, the user themselves can go in and like 1 or 2 clicks reconnect it. Whereas before they would have to tell us, hey, it's not working. And then we would have to go in to like reconnect it. So that user experience is just a lot better for them.
Yeah, much less, yeah, a lot less back and forth because it's under their control, which is really great for
Yeah.
them. Um,
Yeah.
I still think you're making it sound a little too easy.
yeah.
I
Yes.
definitely am. Definitely
Want
making it sound too easy.
to like move off. If someone wants to move off an again and do what we're doing, like, what do they need to know?
All
What are
right.
like pros and cons for real?
They need a magic software developer like Xavier.
Yeah, for sure.
They need Xavier.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
right.
you're not going to have to like rebuild N8N per se, but all of the things that N8N is doing for you out of the box, you have to roll that solution yourself. So for instance, the data connections to different services within, like I said, it's like a box of Legos, right? So you pull out the Legos that you want and they make it really easy to connect. For us, we have to develop each of those connections individually. So like our connection to Google, to Gmail, to Docs, we have to do that ourselves, right? Our connection to your ESP, right? Whether that be MailChimp or Constant Contact or Beehive, we have to create those connections individually. Your connections to the note-taking apps like Otter AI and Firefly, etc., Granola, we have to roll those connections ourselves. So there's I would say at least an order of magnitude more work that you need to do on the back end, if not 2 orders of magnitude. But the trade-off is that you get more control over how those things work. Whereas when you're going with N8N, you have to go with however they set up the connections and you can't really change it. We can change ours and reconfigure ours to our needs since we're rolling those connections ourselves. Also, there are some connections that don't come out of the box with N8N and you have to create them yourself through N8N. So we can also add connections that may not be inside of N8N. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but we can basically plug into any app or any platform that has an API or like a webhook.
Much more complicated. But again, you're building it from
Yeah.
scratch. That's
Yeah.
that's the thing. You're building it from scratch, and it's a very like our the all throughout those iterations that we've got, this latest iteration is, it's a whole box of tools. Before it was
Yeah.
like, you've really created this, where before we were doing a lot of things manually with capture, like particularly, Lucy was talking about capturing people's ideas. You've now built that in so that people can connect all the locations where they capture the ideas. So like, Firefly,
Yeah.
Otter. And so before, where we were doing that manually, now V2 is going to have that all built in. So that, like you're saying, the order of magnitude, the build, it's huge compared to where we started.
Yeah.
And it was a necessity for us because of the kind of product that we wanted to deliver. And it also makes it
Sure.
easier for us, for Lucy, for HyperFix and things like that.
Yeah. So that feature, that plugging into the note-taking apps, is probably the thing that I'm most interested in. That's a lot of people don't know, but this podcast that we do, we actually use this to help create the HyperFix issue for that week. So being able to pull a transcript from a video or from a YouTube or from a podcast or from your own meeting notes, and then being able to control in our interface what information from that meeting is like not allowed to seep out. So that's another level of control.
Privacy.
You can tell our agents, we don't want to talk about like this specific client or this specific, you might have made a political joke, like, hey, we don't want that to be inside of the newsletter. So them having that kind of control, I think is really cool. And I'm also excited about our external tool, our Chrome extension, that will allow you to capture ideas like in the moment. So while you're reading the article, you can clip an idea from that article and put it into a newsletter, or write a note to yourself while you're listening to a podcast or watching a YouTube video. So, those two things are very, very happy about those.
Yeah, and everything's native to our platform, like our V2. And I think that's also just obviously what makes the user experience so much easier and less frustrating because it's all just there, like the touch of a button, basically.
Yeah. So it sounds like if someone wants to do what we've done, it should be a project that like is really going to get them right, because we want to kind of go this complex.
Yeah.
And something you're going to use for like a while, for years to come, knowing you're going to probably continue to improve it. It's like I think we mentioned before, tech is like a living organism. You have to keep tending to it and fixing
Yep.
things and updating and upgrading, especially as AI changes so rapidly in capabilities. So I think, it's like, it's one thing if you're just trying to create like a really easy agent to like streamline your social media accounts and uh, your content calendar. But if you want to do something that can function semi-autonomously, then really getting that ROI. Think about what that thing is that could be the domino in your business. We all have those things. We just don't have the bandwidth. We like newsletters. If you want to write a good newsletter and you are well researched and thoughtful and takeaways, analysis, trends, this takes some time. It
Yeah.
really does. It's like, and so that not, yeah, I want to see more ideas get out in the world while recognizing that not everybody has the bandwidth to run like their own. It's like an online publication, basically, if you do it really
Yeah.
well.
And what
So
we've,
oh, go ahead.
sorry. I was going to say what we've built is definitely not something you can build in a day, right? This has taken us, just as V2 has taken us a year of iteration through 3 or 4 different versions, plus a few months of us developing the V2, right? So this isn't something you can build in a day. And then once we have it built, this is something, like you said, Lucy, that will require continued building and maintenance and acquiescing, all of these things. So yeah, nothing you can build in a day. Also, the other big thing about our platform is that for you to build something on this scale, it only makes sense if you're trying to manage like multiple newsletters for multiple organizations. So although not every user of our platform or our service will be doing that, our company and service itself, that's what we're doing. We're managing multiple newsletters and for multiple organizations at the same time. So we had to build like a much more robust system and something that's the users themselves can custom, not just for their organization, but for, maybe they have different newsletters for their organization. Each of those can be custom to their needs.
Exactly.
We've been talking about what we do and, like what we're building. And this for anyone who is interested to learn more or understand exactly how this all looks. We consider ourselves a done with you newsletter agency. I don't like the word agency, but you're done for you partner, I would say. And so that means that we facilitate a lot of the content strategy, the ideation, market research, understanding the audience, the voice, the tone, all of that, and how to position your newsletter, everything from what to name it to how to position it so that it can become something that generates a lot of ROI, whether that's just building an audience where, you can attract more leads, or you can launch a product to, or you just want to create a digital media asset that runs off ads and becomes a profit center in your business or standalone profit generator. That's all the things like we can give you the best shot in building your newsletter to do those things. Obviously that comes from like my copywriting and marketing background. And then, as a done with you partner, I know the idea of V2 is that the user will help the user with their inputs into the agent, get them all set up. We'll help with editorial strategy every month as they're using it. But they'll kind of be using this as a subscription with that support built in. And then we're managing the tech side, updates, improving functionality, adding new features, getting feedback. So I think, we saw there's many parts to this. So on its own, at this juncture, we didn't really see it as like completely a SaaS product, and we didn't really see ourselves as completely an agency. Like, here, give us all your stuff. We're just going to go do it in the back end. Here's a middle way of we're your partners. We're holding your hands through this because AI is kind of complicated, if especially if you're running a company and you have a lot of time to invest. This not only cuts down the cost of time, people you'd hire to write your newsletter and assemble it, though that time cost, those resources, all that bandwidth is like significantly reduced by having like a partnership, that we help you launch. And then we get on a weekly publishing schedule, whether that's once a week, once a month, a couple times a month. And we help optimize that. We look at your stats, we look at the growth. It's one thing to publish an email newsletter, it's another thing to grow it and build the audience.
For sure.
Definitely.
I think my favorite thing about our company, to kind of reiterate your point, is the human in the loop aspect of it. Not just on our side, but also we give, the tools for the user to do it on their side. So you have the human in the loop at the beginning, you have the human in the loop in the end, and we're using AI in the middle, like you said, Lucy, to compress the time, the energy, the effort, the dollars it would cost to produce something very, very high quality. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. And I think the way that the design has happened and the iteration that's happened over time has just really brought that process of capture, from the capturing of the idea, the iteration, and just watching it grow. Because I think that's the thing, is from what you start, over the publishing period, whether it's weeks or monthly or whatever, you just see how that capture and the data, it just grows the quality grows really quickly because of the way our system keeps things and captures things. And it's like it just builds and builds and builds on that initial foundation that you start with. And I think that that's really, really a cool process to watch happen, for clients. Yeah. And human first. Yeah. And always human first. I think that's also, human first, practical. Yeah, definitely.